When you think of motorsports, the first thing that comes to mind are speed, competition, and excitement. It's one of the most adrenaline-pumping forms of entertainment in the world. But one aspect that many people tend to forget is the risk that comes with it. Risk that can not only harm the drivers, but everyone involved at the event. As time has gone on, nearly every form of motorsport has taken major steps forward when it comes to safety. But behind every major safety rule, every redesign, and every warning flag, there's usually a story that came before it. Today, we look at real-life motorsports incidents that changed the trajectory of racing forever. Pull them belts tight as we drive into the darkest corners of motorsports. What you are watching are clips of the 1981 Indianapolis 500. Known to many as one of the most infamous Indy 500s in history, it holds this title for many reasons, particularly due to the ending of the race. However, that's not the main focus of this video. Instead, our focus is what happened near the beginning of the race, near lap 58, and what has to be considered to many as one of the most bizarre-looking incidents in racing history. During a round of pit stops, future racing legend Rick Mears came in for what was supposed to be a routine stop. The plan was simple: change all 4 tires, make minor adjustments, and refuel the car with methanol fuel. But almost immediately after the fueling process began, something went wrong. Within seconds, crew members began throwing their arms into the air, yelling that fuel had spilled onto the car and that a fire had broken out inside the pit stall. And that was the terrifying realization, because unlike gasoline fires, methanol flames are nearly invisible in daylight, meaning the safety crews were about to fight a fire they could barely see. As panic and pandemonium raced through the Rick Mears pit, the situation became almost impossible to read in real time. There was no towering flame, no thick black smoke, just men suddenly reacting to something no one could actually see. Crew members began jumping back, some instinctively patting at their suits, others waving frantically as the safety crews rushed in with hoses. And within seconds, Mears' car and the surrounding pit area was being doused in foam and water. To anyone watching, it looked chaotic, almost overblown. But this was the terrifying reality of methanol. Mears himself remained in the cockpit, visor down, surrounded by the commotion. The crew worked quickly, not just to save the race, but to make sure everyone walked away from the stall. And just as quickly as it started, it was over. The fire was contained, and remarkably, nobody was seriously injured. Surprisingly, after everything that just unfolded, no major changes were made. No overhaul of pit lane procedures, no immediate restrictions on fueling. The incident in Rick Mears' pit box was ultimately written off as just that, a freak accident. An unfortunate, chaotic, but isolated moment in an otherwise controlled environment. And at that time, that probably felt reasonable, because surely a fuel incident of that magnitude on a stage that big wasn't something the sport would see again. Right? At the 1981 Norton, Michigan 500, everything that didn't happen at Indianapolis suddenly did. On lap 25, during a round of pit stops under caution, Herm Johnson pulled in for what should have been a routine service. Fuel hose on, methanol flowing, crew members moving with precision. But then, something went wrong. Whether it was a loose connection, a spill, or pressure in the fueling rig, didn't matter. In an instant, fuel ignited. And this time, there was no mystery. No invisible danger. The fire announced itself immediately. Flames shot up around the car, bright, aggressive, and spreading faster than anyone could react. What had been a controlled pit stop just seconds earlier turned into complete chaos. Crew members didn't hesitate. They scattered. Some leapt over pit walls, others ran blindly down pit lane, and a few were caught dangerously close as the flames expanded outward, fed by the very fuel that was next to the pit stalls. Safety crews rushed in, fire extinguishers, hoses, anything they could get their hands on. But unlike Indianapolis, this fire couldn't be contained. The fire spread to those nearby pit boxes almost instantly, and what looked to be a pit road moments ago now resembled a war zone. The fire became so severe that track crews alone could not extinguish it. Firefighters from the Cambridge Township Fire Department were eventually called in and managed to contain the blaze after several minutes. It was a full-blown pit lane disaster. 14 people were injured in the fire. 12 were treated for minor burns at the track hospital, including Herb Johnson, who surprisingly only suffered minor facial burns. The race itself was red flagged for 97 minutes while damaged equipment and pit boxes were replaced. It was now the third major pit fire in just 2 months. In the months and years that followed, IndyCar and officials began tightening fueling procedures across pit lane. Fueling equipment was redesigned to reduce the chances of leaks and pressure failures. Standardized procedures were introduced to control how and when fuel could be delivered. Safety crews and fire response protocols were improved. And most importantly, awareness around methanol fires changed completely. Over time, these changes would evolve even further, eventually leading to the highly controlled, safety-focused pit environments we see today. Because in 1981, the sport learned something the hard way. The danger wasn't just in the speed or the racing, it was in the moments in between. Moments where a single fueling mistake could turn an ordinary pit stop into something far more dangerous. What you're watching are scenes from the 1986 Rally de Portugal, a race that for many marked the beginning of the end for one of the most dangerous eras in motorsports history. To understand what happened here, you first have to understand Group B rally cars. These weren't just rally cars, they were monsters. Lightweight, turbocharged, pushing well over 500 horsepower in an era where control systems were nearly non-existent. And they weren't racing on closed circuits. They were racing through narrow roads, forests, villages, with fans standing just feet away. Sometimes way too close. For years, this was the spectacle, the thrill, the identity of rally racing. But in Portugal, that line between spectacle and danger finally broke. On March 5th, 1986, during the opening stage of the Rally de Portugal, as cars tore through the stages at unbelievable speeds, crowds packed the roads tighter than ever. Fans leaned into the racing line, waiting for one of their favorite drivers to pass, by Joaquim Santos, driving his Ford RS 200. Fans packed dangerously close, just like they always had. It had always been risky, but this time it went too far. As Santos came through the stage, something unsettled the car. Whether it was a bump, a loss of traction, or simply the unpredictability of a Group B machine at the limit, in an instant, he lost control. The car veered offline, straight into the crowd. Spectators scattered, but many had nowhere to go. The impact was immediate. His co-driver Miguel had this to say: "I didn't see anybody. I didn't see anything because everything was on the left side of the car. I felt the whack, whack, whack of the car hitting people. But then I came out from the right and they took me and put me in a car." 3 died instantly, including a mother and her 11-year-old son. Another child was killed, and one person died later in a hospital. Scattered around the car, 32 more were seriously injured. Santos couldn't move. Uninjured, he sat in the seat with his head on the wheel. factory teams began to withdraw, not because of mechanical failures, not because of competition, but because they refused to continue. The conditions, the danger, the lack of control, it had all become too much. And for the first time, the question wasn't how fast can these cars go, because this wasn't just about one crash. It was about a formula that had gone too far. Too powerful, too fast, too uncontrolled. Just months later, the governing body of rally racing, the Federal Internationale de Automobile, better known as the FIA, made a decision that would change the sport forever. Group B was no more. Not phased out, not revised, but banned. Effective at the end of the 1986 season, because in Portugal, the risks were no longer theoretical. They were real, they were visible, and they had consequences. For years, the danger in Group B was part of the appeal. But in 1986 at Portugal, it became the reason it had to end. When it comes to pure raw excitement in motorsports, few series come close to MotoGP. This is the pinnacle of motorcycle racing. No doors, no roll cages, no margin of error, just riders pushing machines to the absolute limit. At speeds well over 200 miles per hour, leaning into the corners at angles that don't even look physically possible, with nothing but leather and a helmet separating them from the pavement. And that's exactly why people watch. But that same excitement comes with a cost, because in MotoGP, especially in its support classes like Moto2, when something goes wrong, there's no buffer, no barrier between the rider and the track, no protection for what's coming behind. And sometimes, the most dangerous part of a crash isn't the fall itself. Which brings us to the 2010 San Marino Grand Prix. At the Misano World Circuit Marco Simoncelli, a Moto2 race was taking place on September 5th in 2010. Participating in the race was a superstar in the making, Shoya Tomizawa, a rising talent, aggressive but precise, and already a race winner earlier that season. And on lap 12, he was right in the middle of the pack. It seemed like any other race day, but that was about to change. Coming through turn 11, Tomizawa suddenly lost control of the bike. The rear stepped out, the front tucked, and he was thrown off his bike and onto the track. At first, it looked routine. Shoya Tomizawa slid through the runoff area, something you see almost every weekend, except there was one problem. The riders behind him were not prepared for the incident. Within seconds, two following riders, Alex DeAngelis and Scott Redding, had nowhere to go. They were already committed to the racing line, already at full speed, and suddenly, both riders struck Tomizawa almost instantly. There was no time to react. The race was immediately red flagged. Medical crews rushed onto the circuit. Tomizawa was transported to a nearby hospital, but the injuries were severe. Later that day, it was confirmed that Shoya Tomizawa had died from his injuries. He was only 19 years old. How could such a young talent be taken away in what looked to be a routine incident? How did it go so bad so quickly? And the worst question of all was, why was the whole situation handled so poorly? While attending to the driver, the race was never stopped for the serious accident, and the stretchers that were brought to aid the driver were hardly handled with care, as many saw them being thrown into the gravel with little to no care. A terrible look for MotoGP as a whole. The incident forced a difficult conversation within the sport. After Tomizawa's tragic crash, MotoGP made a plethora of changes to their safety protocols. They introduced mandatory chest and back protectors for all classes, as well as tougher crash tests for motorcycles and their components. But most importantly, The sport introduced faster and more efficient medical response systems, a huge necessity in a sport that was as dangerous as MotoGP. It was a heartbreak to lose a young talent that had so much potential in one of the top motorsports in the world, not even in his 20s, and he was already gone. It just shows how dangerous a sport like MotoGP can be. Not only do you have to worry about the lack of protection around your machine, but you have to pray that everyone else is 100% prepared when you go down. In our final story, we look at what has to be one of my favorite forms of racing, NASCAR. For more than 75 years, NASCAR has gone through a massive transformation. What once began as a rough and gritty sport filled with former moonshiners and local short track racers eventually evolved into a multi-million-dollar industry with massive race teams, corporate sponsors, and some of the biggest names in motorsports. It was an incredible accomplishment for the sport, but to many fans, something about NASCAR's old charm slowly began to disappear along the way. There was once a time where almost anyone with enough courage could attempt to race in NASCAR, but by the time the 90s rolled around, those days were mostly gone. Many fans and racers still longed for the return of a more affordable path into the sport, and NASCAR believed that they finally found the answer. Introducing the NASCAR Sportsman division, a division created by Humpy Wheeler that was designed to give regional and short track drivers a chance to compete on the same high-speed superspeedways as NASCAR's biggest stars. The concept sounded simple. Drivers used older race cars, smaller carburetors, and reduced horsepower to help keep costs down. But in reality, it created a dangerous combination. Inexperienced drivers racing obsolete cars at speeds far beyond what they were used to. It was a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, disaster was exactly what followed. Throughout the division's existence from 1989 to 1995, multiple serious injuries and fatalities occurred due to both driver inexperience and the lack of modern safety features in the cars themselves. NASCAR had found a way to make racing more affordable, but the costs were being cut in some of the worst possible places. Still, the series pushed forward, hoping the early tragedies were simply part of a brutal learning curve, that they had already seen the worst this division had to offer. They hadn't. On October 6, 1995, the Sportsman 100 took place at Charlotte Motor Speedway, one of NASCAR's most iconic racetracks. Although weather delays in a smaller field had hurt excitement around the event, many still hoped the division could survive in NASCAR's booming future and continue giving grassroots racers an opportunity to compete on the sport's biggest stages. One of the drivers leading the field to green was North Carolina self-funded driver and team owner Russell Phillips in the number 57 car. Russell wasn't a superstar. He didn't have a massive resume or a major race team behind him. He was simply an everyday racer chasing a dream, believing that the Sportsman division might finally give him his shot. He started on the front row, led several laps early, and slowly began falling back through the field. At first, it looked like a typical race for an underfunded short track racer trying to survive against tougher competition. But by lap 17, everything changed. Coming out of turn 4, a crash erupted in the front of the pack, forcing multiple drivers to react instantly. In the chaos, driver Stephen Howard drifted slightly higher up the racetrack, making contact with Russell Phillips' car and launching it, roof first, into the catch fence. What happened next became one of the most horrifying crashes in NASCAR history. The moment the roof struck the fencing, the entire roof structure failed. The roll cage collapsed, the roof was torn away, and Russell Phillips absorbed the full impact as the car scraped violently against the catch fence for nearly 100 feet. The car eventually slid back into the grass, but something was terribly wrong. There was a massive opening where the roof once was, When safety crews reached the car, they immediately knew there was nothing they could do. Russell Phillips was pronounced dead at the scene. He was only 26 years old. Even more shocking was the fact that the race continued despite the severity of the accident. But after that night, the future of the Sportsman division became painfully clear. By the end of 1995, major superspeedways no longer wanted the series on their schedule, and without those tracks, the division had lost the very purpose it was created for. By 1996, the NASCAR Sportsman division had effectively come to an end. However, one lasting change did emerge from the tragedy. In the aftermath of the crash, NASCAR introduced additional roof reinforcement bars designed to better protect the driver compartment during violent impacts and roof failures. Many fans today refer to this support as the Earnhardt bar, believed it was introduced after one of Dale Earnhardt's crashes at Talladega Superspeedway. But many within the racing community also believe the Russell Phillips crash played a major role in pushing NASCAR towards the safety modifications. Thankfully, since these reinforcements became mandatory in 1996, no NASCAR crash involving a roof failure of this magnitude has ever happened again. The intention behind the Sportsman division was good. It was meant to create an affordable opportunity for grassroots racers to compete at some of the biggest tracks in America, but in trying to lower cost, safety became one of the sacrifices. And at speeds this high, that was a price far too dangerous to pay, leading to one of the darkest corners in NASCAR history.